Thank you, Raihan, for those kind words and for the invitation to speak today. I'm also grateful to the Manhattan Institute and the National Press Club for hosting us. I want to recognize Paul Singer and Roger Hertog, who generously support the Manhattan Institute's important work. 5 years ago, I spoke at some length on the subject of crime and violence in our streets. At the time, our nation was in the grips of the Obama crime wave of 2015 and 16. We experienced the steepest two-year increase in murder in half a century and a significant rise in violent crime. That crime wave resulted directly from the Obama administration's pro-criminal and anti-police policies. Federal malfeasance compounded the harm inflicted by the Ferguson effect, itself the acute consequence of heightened anti-police activism and anti-enforcement policies at the local level. I warned at the time that criminal leniency proposals being adopted across the nation, quote, are not merely wrong, they are dangerous. They threaten a return to the worst days of the 1990s when law-abiding citizens lived in fear of their lives, end quote. Based on the number of unsolved murders and rapes and serious crimes, I contended that far from a fabled over-incarceration problem, America had an under-incarceration problem. Woolly-headed critics across the political spectrum condemned me for saying this. But I was right then, and I'm right now. Tragically, my prediction at the time was, if anything, too optimistic. Because as far too many Americans know firsthand, the coronavirus pandemic wasn't the only crisis that struck our nation last year. A contagion of crime and a growing epidemic of drug abuse afflicted the nation as well and infected almost every community and neighborhood in America. Those at the Manhattan Institute know this firsthand. The Big Apple, which you call home, has gone from one of the safest metropolitan areas in America to a city terrorized by a nearly 100% increase in shootings and a stunning 44% increase in murder last year. And violence has indeed come very close to your doorstep. Just 2 months ago, not far from your headquarters in New York City, police stopped a man named Takim Newsom for suspicion of driving under the influence. When Newsom admitted that he was high, the officer asked him to step out of the car. Instead, Newsom sped away, dragging the officer with him. Newsom then tried to rob a 66-year-old woman in her home and stole a car. After a manhunt, he was apprehended and put in jail. But what's remarkable is that he should have been behind bars to begin with. He had been charged with attempted murder just 2 months before, but had been released without bail, even against the advice of his own defense attorney. This story of weak-on-crime policies resulting in pain and suffering for innocent Americans and selfless police is not unique. It is played out in countless communities across the country. The nationwide surge in violent crime that started last year and continues today is far worse and more pervasive than anything during the Obama years. Indeed, this level of violence would have been nearly unimaginable 5 short years ago. Last year, the United States experienced the largest single-year increase in murder on record and the most drug overdose deaths in our nation's history. Murder nationwide rose by an astonishing 25%. Aggravated assaults increased in 56 of the 66 largest American cities, and 88,000 of our fellow Americans lost their lives to drug overdoses. As I predicted, the murder rate has now reached the highest level since the 1990s. This violent crime wave surprised many people. After all, starting in 2017, our nation got a reprieve from the criminal leniency policies of the Obama administration. Violent crime rates turned around and began declining in the first 3 years of the Trump administration, largely because of increased federal prosecutions of drug trafficking, gun offenses, and other violent crime. A 46% increase in federal funding to local and state law enforcement and a crackdown on illegal immigration also helped matters. But even during those years of progress, the seeds of a future crime wave took root. Radical, left-wing prosecutors, many with campaigns funded by George Soros, won elections in major American cities and adopted radical criminal leniency policies. In cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and San Francisco, district attorneys began refusing to prosecute laws against shoplifting, vagrancy, and entire categories of misdemeanors. Let me give you just one example close to home. In Washington, just a few weeks ago, a member of my staff had his car stolen right out of his driveway. When it was recovered, thanks to a GPS tracker, law enforcement in D.C. refused to dust the car for prints or conduct any investigation into theft. It simply wasn't worth their time. In cities where they have taken over, Soros prosecutors coddle even violent career criminals, often with sweetheart deals. On the rare occasion when they go to trial, these criminals might as well have two advocates in the room, while the public and the victims have none. But the rise of the so-called progressive prosecutors wasn't the only development that led to higher crime. Governors and mayors employed a form of nullification, creating so-called sanctuary jurisdictions that shielded criminal aliens from prosecution. Many states across the nation naively began to close prisons and loosen sentencing requirements. And several states and cities have relentlessly undermined our cash bail system with predictable consequences. In late 2019, the New York State Legislature passed the most progressive cash bail legislation in the country. And by February 2020, crime in New York City skyrocketed by 22.5%. Criminals who were released from custody without bail went on to commit 800 new crimes, including rape, robbery, and murder. After seeing the self-inflicted devastation on their own state, even the liberals in Albany admitted the policy was a mistake and rushed to revoke their ill-conceived law. But this didn't stop the governor of Illinois. He signed a law to end all cash bail in the state by 2023, as if crime in Chicago wasn't already bad enough. Of course, it's not billionaires like Governor Pritzker who will suffer from the consequences of his mistakes. Other states are still considering and implementing this insane policy, which will inevitably increase crime just as it did in New York. But these state and local changes aren't the only criminal leniency policies that were adopted in the last few years. In a grave bipartisan mistake, Congress passed the First Step Act with 87 votes in the U.S. Senate. I led the opposition to that bill, and I was one of only 12 senators who opposed it. No doubt, many politicians supported the First Step Act with the best of intentions, out of Christian charity and a desire to help criminals reform their ways. I know many of them. I can vouch for that. But this bill, which was sold as relief for so-called nonviolent, low-level offenders, was in reality a dangerous jailbreak that unleashed thousands of hardened criminals and experienced drug traffickers back onto the streets. I shouldn't have to say this, but apparently I do. drug traffickers are not engaged in a non-violent offense. Their practice is intimidation. Their product is poison. And their customer service is the barrel of a gun. And no, contrary to the false narrative peddled by some, federal prisons are not filled with sympathetic, first-time, low-level, nonviolent drug offenders. It's just not true. Virtually no one serves a long federal sentence for simple drug possession. The drug traffickers in federal prisons are serious, violent, and repeat offenders who cause death and destruction everywhere they go. These merchants of misery didn't deserve leniency, and many should count themselves lucky that they were never charged with murder. Yet the First Step Act retroactively released many of these career criminals anyway. So the conditions for a crime wave were building before the pandemic reached our shores. Now let me be clear about something. The pandemic didn't accelerate the crime wave because people were laid off or isolated or bored. Other countries hit even harder by the coronavirus didn't see a spike in violent crime anywhere close to the one that we are experiencing. Rather, state and local federal officials foolishly slashed their prison populations by a stunning 25% in 2020 under the guise of so-called coronavirus protocols. Some of these beneficiaries were young violent offenders who immediately returned to a life of crime. In the case of Rikers Island, authorities released 1,500 prisoners. Within less than 2 months, over 100 were back in jail. One of their most common offenses was burglary. And their crimes fueled a spike in break-ins. So much for the claim that these were harmless criminals. Next came the anarchy and rioting that followed the death of George Floyd. Rather than restoring order while allowing nonviolent demonstrations, liberal officials around the country responded with insane policies that undercut the rule of law. Soros prosecutors refused to do their job as more than 500 violent riots broke out across the nation. Over 2,000 police officers were injured and line-of-duty deaths rose by 28%. Dozens of Americans were killed, and between $1 billion and $2 billion worth of damage was inflicted. The riots last summer were collectively the most destructive in American history. Simultaneously, the consequences of the Ferguson effect paled in comparison to the devastation wreaked by the BLM effect, which massively curtailed policing in neighborhoods most in need of vigilant law enforcement. Here are just a few examples. From the summer of 2020 to the winter of last year, police in Chicago made 53% fewer arrests compared to the same period in 2019. As a result, murder in the city rose by 65%. In New York, police made 38% fewer arrests. Murders rose by 58%. In Louisville, police made 35% fewer arrests. Murders rose by 87%. And in Minneapolis, police made 42% fewer arrests and murders rose by 64%. I detect a pattern. Leading Democrats called to defund the police, and at least 20 major cities agreed, slashing their police departments to the tune of $840 million. New York City alone shifted nearly $1 billion from the NYPD, and Los Angeles cut funding to its police department by $150 million. But the radicals didn't stop at defunding the police. They defamed and demoralized and disarmed our men and women in blue. Portland announced that it would no longer allow its police to use tear gas against violent demonstrators. The Seattle and Philadelphia city councils voted to ban the use of pepper spray. Many other cities limited the use of rubber bullets. It's no surprise that in such a toxic environment, police retirements surged. 15% in Chicago, 37% in Las Vegas, 72% in New York City. And recruiting is just as bad. As officers ask me when I travel around the country and speak to them about how recruiting and retention is going, who would want to be police in today's environment? And it's not because they aren't willing to put themselves in harm's way to protect the vulnerable. It's because they know that pro-criminal policies are making it impossible to do their job. This concerted nationwide attack on police is nothing less than the gravest assault on the rule of law in modern times. The simple fact is that today's Democratic Party is pro-riot, anti-cop, and anti-prosecutor. Democrats today have more sympathy for violent criminals than for innocent victims. And when given power, they turn our criminal justice system into a criminal's justice system. Democrats and BLM leaders ignore an obvious truth. If you stop enforcing the law, you will catch fewer criminals, and they will commit more and usually worse crimes. Again, I can hardly believe that it needs to be said. And neither can most Americans with an ounce of common sense. But Democrats and BLM leaders long ago took leave of their senses and put their ideology ahead of your safety. Let's take a tour of the West Coast, a hotbed of far-left progressive policies, to see what happens to the rule of law when Democrats are in charge of public safety. In Portland, they defunded the police. Portland, of course, witnessed some of the worst rioting last summer. Yet city leaders consistently undermined their police and, as of January, had refused to prosecute more than 90% of arrested rioters who were responsible for 100 nights of destruction. The city government slashed its police budget by $27 million and gratuitously disbanded a special gun violence unit as well, all with predictable results. This year alone, Portland has suffered a 5-fold increase in murder. Shootings have doubled. That's compared to the same time last year. Crime is so rampant and police resources are so overstretched that residents now must wait 40 minutes before even getting a hold of an emergency dispatcher. Last week, the entire Portland Rapid Response Team resigned en masse, and more than 10% of the Portland Police Department has left the force in just the last 9 months. And frankly, I'm surprised it's not more. While Portland provides us a cautionary tale against defunding the police, Seattle ran an experiment in abolishing the police. As you may recall, a group of BLM activists and Antifa radicals joined together there and created the so-called Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, better known by its acronym, the CHAZ. These armed neo-secessionists began their insurrection by forcing a police precinct to evacuate. Next, they barricaded the streets and declared a rogue province free of police and law enforcement. At the entrance to CHAZ, they hung up a sign that read, "You are now leaving the USA." Seattle's clueless mayor, Jenny Durkin, refused to act decisively against these outlaws, instead declaring it a summer of love. Inside CHAZ, it was anything but. Vandalism, disorderly conduct, and theft went unpunished. Reports of more severe crimes started to trickle out. Not surprisingly, CHAZ residents embraced vigilante justice without trial or due process. Soon enough, order broke down entirely, and the anti-police experiment came to an end after 24 days. But not before 2 persons were murdered and 4 more were shot. All the victims were black men. Someone should ask the liberals who run Seattle if their lives mattered. I think they did. The final story from out west is about Chesa Boudin, the district attorney in San Francisco. Most of America has probably never heard of him, but he illustrates very well the radical pedigree and dangers of the so-called progressive prosecutors. Boudin grew up in red diapers. His family trafficked in far-left activism going back generations. His parents were left-wing weather underground terrorists who went to prison for murdering 2 police officers and a security guard when he was a young child. Their fellow weather underground terrorists and Barack Obama's friends and mentors, Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn, took custody of Chesa and raised him. Boudin lived up to this family tradition, dabbling in left-wing politics and even serving in Venezuela as a translator for Marxist dictator Hugo Chavez. Unfortunately, he brought his radicalism back home, defending criminals for a living. Last year, Boudin became district attorney in San Francisco and immediately took criminal leniency to new extremes and public safety to new lows. Let me give you just one example of Chesa Boudin's handiwork. A criminal named Troy McAllister, who faced a well-deserved life sentence as a result of California's 3 strikes laws and his long and violent criminal record, which included multiple robberies, thefts, and an attempted carjacking. Boudin was well aware of McAllister's criminal history because he was McAllister's defense attorney before he was elected district attorney. Despite this conflict of interest, or perhaps because of it, Boudin cut a deal with McAllister and released him back onto the streets. I think you can all guess what happened next. McAllister committed a series of crimes leading to 3 separate arrests, but Boudin refused to charge him each time. Then on New Year's Eve of last year, McAllister had quite a night. He got a gun, stole a car, robbed a bakery, and then sped through the city until he ran over 2 women crossing the road. One was a 60-year-old homeless woman named Elizabeth. The other was a 27-year-old Japanese immigrant named Hanako Abe. McAllister hit both women so hard with his stolen pickup truck that they were literally knocked out of their shoes. Both women died from their injuries. McAllister's own uncle expressed shock that Boudin had let his nephew out of jail, saying, quote, "I don't know why they released him. I really cannot understand it." End quote. I can answer that question. Boudin released McAllister because he is a radical ideologue who puts half-baked far-left politics over the safety of our citizens. Hanako and Elizabeth and many other San Franciscans are dead because Chesa Boudin refused to do his job. Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, all run entirely by Democrats, like so many other cities suffering from this crime wave. One Democrat above all could speak out against this insanity, and that's Joe Biden. If the president were the Joe Biden of the 1990s, who claimed to be tough on crime and vainly bristled that the Clinton crime bill should be called the Biden crime bill, perhaps he would. But this Joe Biden is hardly better than Chesa Boudin. After all, he nominated as a vice president a woman who encouraged donations last summer to a bail fund for rioters and looters. It's only gotten worse since Joe Biden took office. The president has stocked his Department of Justice with pro-criminal lawyers. Attorney General Merrick Garland wants to reduce prison sentences for drug traffickers and gang members. Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta has testified that every single American citizen and institution is racist. Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark has adamantly championed the cause of defunding the police. But the president doesn't stop there. He wants to eliminate qualified immunity for police so criminals can sue cops. He supports ending cash bail, which, as we've seen, would unleash thousands of career criminals onto the streets to commit more crimes and intimidate their victims and witnesses. The president supports sanctuary cities and has slashed immigration enforcement. Under this administration, ICE deportations have fallen to their lowest level on record, while illegal border crossings have reached a 21-year high. Illegal aliens, including criminal aliens and cartel members, feel welcomed in Joe Biden's America. Just this week, the president also endorsed reducing criminal sentencing for crack dealers. The only solution that the president has recommended to fight violent crime is the same one he impotently proposes again and again after every tragedy: a crackdown on the Second Amendment. A gun grabber's wish list is not an anti-crime agenda. What we heard the other day from the president was sadly little more than the same tired liberal talking points that created this crime wave in the first place. Every one of these actions endanger the American people and make our streets less safe. After just a few months in office, the Biden administration is well on its way to becoming the most pro-crime administration in history. Though the president has turned his back on the hardworking, law-abiding citizens he once championed, normal Americans still see and feel the heartbreak. According to Gallup, 78% of Americans are concerned about rising crime, and more than half the country thinks that the problem is extremely or very serious. Just as normal Americans understand the problem better than Washington, they also know the solution: more and better policing. Twice as many Americans believe that the criminal justice system is too soft on criminals compared to those who think it's too tough. And 86% of Americans want more or the same amount of time from the police in their communities, including 81% of blacks. Indeed, blacks and Hispanics are actually more likely than whites to want an increased police presence in their communities. Yet every day we are told by the nation's elite that Americans actually want more leniency and weakness towards criminals. That's partly because rich celebrities and entitled intellectuals and powerful politicians live behind gated walls and have armed security guards. For them, crime is a distant, abstract thing. But for working class and minority Americans, crime is all too often a daily reality. Limousine liberals like Ibram Henry Rogers, who now calls himself Ibram X. Kendi, and Al Sharpton believe that engendering social strife is the answer. The American people know that they're wrong. Americans understand that we need more law enforcement, not more division. None of the charlatans and grifters who attack our police have ever walked a beat in a dangerous neighborhood, or run to the sound of gunfire, or kicked down a door after reports of domestic violence. Now, paid speeches and TV contracts and fundraising galas aren't quite as dangerous, or quite so noble either. Police officers doing the hard work of saving lives and changing communities for the better are the ones who are taking these risks. Left-wing agitators, on the other hand, are encouraging crime and suffocating opportunity. But the American people know who the real heroes are. And from our city halls to the halls of Congress, our leaders need to get on the same page as our people. It's time to get tough on crime again, and I suggest 4 basic principles to do so. First, as I've said before, we don't have an over-incarceration problem. We have an under-incarceration problem in America. In 2019, even before the recent crime surge, only 41% of violent crime, 34% of sexual assaults, and 32% of property crimes were even reported to the police. Only a fraction of those reports ever led to an arrest or a conviction. And when they did, on average, state prisoners serve only 44% of their sentences. Murderers, on average, serve less than 60% of their sentences. Murderers. These facts paint a clear picture that more criminals should be in jail today, not fewer. So before you saddle up your high horse about so-called over-incarceration or mass incarceration, go tell it to a rape victim whose rapist was never brought to justice, or to the family of a murder victim who never got justice. Why don't you let me know what they think? Second, the only good Soros prosecutor is a defeated Soros prosecutor. These radicals have no business holding any public office anywhere in our nation. Every single one of them should be recalled, removed, and replaced. It's very simple. If you do not want to prosecute crime, you should not be a prosecutor. Third, if we did not have a border crisis, we would not have a drug crisis. The majority of meth, heroin, cocaine, and fentanyl comes across our southern border. This year alone, the Border Patrol has seized enough deadly doses of fentanyl to kill every single American several times over. If we secure our border, we can block this flow of deadly narcotics and save tens of thousands of lives. If not, more Americans will continue to die as a result. An open border is a death sentence for many Americans. Fourth, policing is one of the great civil rights issues of our time. Weak policing, weak prosecuting, and weak sentencing hurts blacks more than any other group of our citizens. African Americans tragically constitute approximately half of all murder victims and regularly suffer the brunt of the damage resulting from riots. The fair-weather protesters who so fondly decry systemic racism fail to see a cruel irony. If, as they claim, racist policy is defined solely by a racially disparate outcome, then their weak-on-crime proposals are, in fact, breathtakingly racist. When it comes to the morality of the rule of law, we should never take lectures from those who coddle criminals. Now, we can put these principles into action in a number of common-sense ways. We can begin by declaring a national emergency and surging resources, technology, and personnel to lock down our southern border. We need to finish the barrier wall on the border while also hardening our ports of entry and ensuring that they have the most advanced drug detection tools in the world. Some may balk at the cost of securing the border, but the cost of an insecure border is far greater. As we secure our border, our government must go beyond simple defense. We must go on offense and fight the drug trade at its source. The United States must lead our labors in Latin America and insist on greater cooperation from them to crack down on our hemisphere's drug cartels. The Sinaloa cartel alone has killed far more Americans than ISIS or Al-Qaeda ever has. And we must not stand by as illicit Chinese super labs continue to ship massive quantities of fentanyl and its chemical precursors to Latin America for production and shipment across our border and into the United States. But we also have to solve our crime problem at home by reinvesting in what one might call the 3 Ps of law enforcement: police, prosecutors, and prisons. We should begin by making a once-in-a-generation investment in police salaries, training, and equipment, with a goal of putting 100,000 new officers on the street. Back in the 1990s, after all, Joe Biden voted for 100,000 new officers. He'd like to take credit for it. For once, he was right. And the solution would help again. These new officers would contribute to more safety, security, and prosperity for our communities. Furthermore, we have to enforce the laws on the books, including so-called minor or lifestyle crimes. That means, once again, fighting vagrancy and vandalism, just as we do violent crime. Disrespect for the law doesn't start with murder, and it must be stopped before it costs lives. Next, we need to ensure that criminals who are put in the squad car are then put behind bars. This means surging federal prosecutors to especially dangerous cities and encouraging voters to remove Soros prosecutors wherever they are found. States should also pass honesty in sentencing legislation so that criminals serve at least 3/4 of their prison sentences. And we must have zero tolerance for rioting and political violence of all kinds, even when criminals have the faddish views of the faculty lounge. Finally, we must invest in our nation's prison system so that our jails and prisons have the resources to safely and securely hold inmates while giving them an opportunity to turn their lives around and become law-abiding, productive members of society. Pre-release integration programming, work training, drug rehabilitation, and mental health resources should be mandatory for prisoners who need it. Our prisons also must not become dens of crime themselves. We should crack down on prison gangs and improve prison safety protocols. Congress should pass my bill to enable prisons to jam the signals of contraband cell phones, the key tool by criminals used to continue committing crimes while in prison. And we should improve pay and benefits for our nation's correctional officers, and likewise expand the ranks of parole officers and encourage increased specialization, all of which reduces recidivism rates. Yes, it will cost money, but public safety is the most basic responsibility of government at every level. Now, some well-meaning people believe that we have too many people in prison already because they compare our prison population with the prison population of other random countries. This is not the way to make policy. The simple truth is this: the right number of people in prison should be determined by the number of people who commit crimes. And once they're convicted, they should be headed to the best and most effective prisons in the world. Some less well-intentioned people assert that building prisons are, in fact, a way to increase the number of prisoners. A backbench congresswoman from New York recently claimed that if you build prisons, they'll operate like the field of dreams. Build it, and they will come. But criminals go to prison for one reason: committing crimes. And refusing to build prisons does not reduce crime. Of course, it would only increase crime by letting criminals remain on the streets. This vigorous, aggressive strategy to break the current crime wave has succeeded in the past, and it will succeed in the future as long as we have the fortitude and courage and discipline to implement it. Safe streets and low crime rates aren't inevitable, but rather require constant vigilance and strong leadership. We must never forget how bad things once were and can become again. Between 1973 and 1991, violent criminals injured nearly 37 million Americans. If crime rates had remained at peak levels, 83% of Americans over the age of 12 would have become a victim of violent crime at some point in their life. 40% would have been injured in a robbery or an assault. If we continue the path we are on, we will return to the dark days of soaring crime and terrifying nights filled with muggings, rapes, and murders. Or we can say once and for all that we will never go back to that. Instead, we will reestablish the rule of law. We will lock up criminals. We will deliver justice for victims, and we will protect the innocent. Thankfully, we have some of the finest men and women anywhere in the world to accomplish this objective. The story of the heroic American lawmen is almost as old as our nation itself. In the days to come, new chapters must be written. Our heroes in blue have been beaten and bruised over this past year, but they are unbowed and unbroken. They have bravely and loyally held the line through chaos and criticism, and now it's time for them to take back our streets. And with our support, I am confident they will. So thank you. God bless you. God bless our police, and God bless the United States of America.